Okay, good morning. Welcome back. In our last lecture, we talked about the range of political alternatives to autocracy that were beginning to form and crystallize into political parties, and I stress illegal political parties, in the early years of the 20th century. Illegal because the autocratic regime, rightly, saw them as threats to the existing political system and sought to stamp them out, uh, confiscate their funds and newspapers, arrest their leaders, imprison them, or send them off into exile in Siberia. And we talked about the SRs, the agrarian socialists, whose principal constituency was the peasants, whose principal political program was the redistribution of land, taking land from those who had it, giving land to the land-hungry peasants. We talked also about the cadets, the liberals, who match in their political views the liberal parties that we find all across Central and Western Europe at this time. Their grievances with the autocratic system are principally political in nature. They want to leave the economic system, market capitalism, untouched, but bring down the autocracy and replace it with an elected representative government beholden to the people, responsible to the people who put them in power, and a government that will guarantee the rights of citizens, the rights of assembly, the right to freedom of speech, the right to political expression, political action, etc. So their demands are principally political. Their constituent base of support, the educated urban professionals, the so-called middle class. Both of those groups, as I mentioned last time, play a role in the events of 1917, in the revolutions of 1917, but ultimately they are losers. And the winners of 1917 are the Marxists. So what I want to do in this lecture is first just kind of step back and think about what we mean when we talk about Marxism. What is Marxism? Why was Marxism appealing to so many in the 19th century? To whom was it appealing? And then from there, look at Russia in particular and think about the reception of Marxism in Russia. Look at the role of Vladimir Lenin, who will be the most prominent of the Russian Marxists and who will lead his wing of the Russian Marxist movement, the Bolsheviks, to power in Russia in the October Revolution of 1917. So I'll split this lecture into two parts. The first part will kind of sketch out Marxism in general. The second lecture that follows will think about the reception of Marxism in Russia and the growth of the Marxist movement in Russia particularly. So if you have a pretty good grounding in Marxism, in Marxist theory, if you've taken courses, if you've read Marx, if you're a Marxist yourself, if you belong to an underground Marxist cell, you can probably safely skip much of what follows in this particular lecture and then kind of rejoin us in the lecture that follows. But I want to just kind of sketch out in this lecture some of the basic ideas of Marxism, because these are the ideas on which the Soviet Union will be founded after the revolution of 1917, the October Revolution. And so to understand the guiding ideas on which that new government, that new society will be formed, it's very important to have at least a cursory passing understanding of and familiarity with Marxism. So let me bring up our slides and kind of sketch out what we're going to do in this lecture. We've talked about the liberals, we've talked about the populists, the SRs. We're going to turn to the Marxists. So what is Marxism? The three aspects, or the four aspects of Marxism that I want to focus on in this lecture are the idea of materialism, the relationship between the so-called base and superstructure, the Marxist theory of historical progress, and the idea of class struggle. Marxism is a philosophy a way of looking at the world, if you will, that's developed in the middle of the 19th century by a German thinker and writer and economist named Karl Marx. And Marx's collected works run to many, many dozens of volumes. If you go to the Mansfield Library and look at the collected writings of Marx, it fills shelf after shelf. But the two most important works authored by Karl Marx, and the ones I want to kind of draw on for our discussion today, are first the Communist Manifesto, which he co-authored with his longtime collaborator and co-writer, Friedrich Engels. The Communist Manifesto, published in 1848. And the other work that's really central to understanding Marxist thought is Das Kapital. That's the German title. We would translate it into English as Capital. And the first volume of Das Kapital appeared in 1867. Now, you can spend years and years studying Marxism and various revisionist theories of Marxism that have emerged in the decades after Marx's death in 1883, but we can distill Marxism, I think, for our purposes at least, down to its fundamental essence. It's about two main principles. The first of these is materialism. What do we mean by materialism? Materialism doesn't mean consumerism. Materialism doesn't mean that you like to go to the mall and buy jeans. Materialism in the 19th century has a very distinct meaning in philosophical circles. Marx was a materialist. Now, when Marx was a college student in the German states in the 1830s, the dominant philosophical intellectual influence on the university students of Marx's generation was the German philosopher Hegel, rhymes with bagel. Hegel was an idealist. Doesn't mean that he was an optimist. In fact, he was rather pessimistic at times. What idealism meant is that for Hegel and his followers, ideas were the principal moving factors that determined the course of history. Great ideas moved across the human landscape throughout time like glaciers, and they left their imprint on society. And it was ideas that were deterministic, to use the phrase that German philosophers were using in the first half of the 19th century. Deterministic meaning that ideas determined outcomes. Marx, by contrast, and others of his generation coming of age in the 1830s, flipped Hegel on his head and said, it's not ideals, it's not ideas, right? Idealism is getting it wrong. We got to go a few steps down and look at the material reality of society. That's what determines how societies progress. That's what determines how history moves forward. By materialism, Marx meant economic relations, or what he called the means of production. If you want to understand a given society, Marx argued, you have to figure out who controls the material base, who controls the means of production, who controls the economic resources in that society. And you start digging there, you start analyzing there, and that tells you what you need to know. So while Hegel and the idealists believed that ideas drove history forward, for Marx, it's the material base of society that we have to study. Ideas are secondary. Ideas emerge out of the material soil in which they are formed. So again, Marx kind of flips Hegel's idealism on its head. For Marx, the economic organization of any society is primary, and that's what we ought to look at. And this gets us to what Marx would call the relationship between the base and the superstructure. And this is a little image that I've found. I like to use this when talking about Marxism. It's actually from an English, British website of teaching Marxism to your kids. But I think it actually works well to illustrate the relationship between the so-called base, the material base, and the realm of the superstructure. Marx argues that in any given society, the economic base, the means of production, how the economic system is organized, that base generates and supports other social and intellectual formations that he called the superstructure. Politics, religion, notions of education, family structures, mass media, morality, ideas of right and wrong, art, aesthetic values, what's beautiful, what's not, literature, culture, science, all of these belong to the so-called superstructure, and they are all determined by, shaped by, formed and created by the economic base. Marx described that relation in a famous phrase by saying that being determines consciousness. Reality, the material reality, determines the range of possible cultural, intellectual, aesthetic, pedagogical, moral, and ethical ideas in any given society. And the red arrow here on the left expresses that relationship. The base, the foundation of the house, if you will, shapes the superstructure. These ideas in the superstructure, ideas of right and wrong, ideas of good and evil, ideas of proper family structure versus improper family structures, ideas of proper morality versus ideas of improper morality. The superstructure then, as the blue arrow suggests, serves to maintain, legitimate, and perpetuate the existing base. So there is a sort of mutually constitutive relationship at work. The base forms the superstructure, but the superstructure generates the kinds of values and ideas that keep the base in power. Let me give you an example of that. Religion was a topic of interest for Marx. Marx was, of course, famously an atheist. He declared that religion is the opium of the people, right? Religion drugs the people into a sense of kind of sedated complacency. It distracts them from their proper goal, which ought to be, for Marx, tearing down the base, creating a new superstructure. But religion was a very interesting topic for Marx, and it's a good example of how the superstructure seeks to keep the base intact and to perpetuate it, to keep it going. Marx said, look at the 10 Commandments. God gave Moses 10 orders, 10 instructions, moral principles on which their society ought to be organized. Embedded in the 10 Commandments is the idea that thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. In other words, religious principles, and this is an example from Marx, exist to stabilize the economic status quo, to keep economic power in the hands of those who have it. So this is the Marxist idea of the base and superstructure. The base creates the superstructure, creates the conditions upon which the superstructure emerges, and then the superstructure reaffirms and perpetuates the base. Different bases, and this is important, will generate different superstructures. So keep that in mind as we move forward. So materialism is key to understanding Marx. If you want to understand society, Marx says, understand who controls the economic means of production. That tells you where you need to start looking to understand who controls political power. Those who control economic power control political power. The other key aspect of Marxist thought that I want to focus on in this lecture is the so-called Marxist theory of historical progression. Marx, like many thinkers in the 19th century, is interested in the idea of how history unfolds, what pushes history forward. In earlier centuries, men and women had argued that the hand of God, taking an active personal interest in human affairs, is what drives history forward. Others argue that mere chance and accident push history forward. Others, like the British historian Thomas Carlyle, in the 19th century are arguing that it's great men, men of vision, men of power, men of might, who leave their stamp on history, who pull history forward through the sheer genius and force of their will. Marx comes up with a very different idea of how history happens, of how history unfolds or progresses. And this is the Marxist theory of historical progression. Marx argues that history is the study of social change, and social change occurs via human forces. If you want to understand history, Marx says, you have to understand the basic economic stages through which all human societies inevitably progress. And that word progress is very important to Marx. Although I've unfortunately rendered this arrow that you see as a flat horizontal arrow moving forward, it might better be represented as a kind of upward angle, moving forward and upward. Not only moving laterally, but a vector that moves upward as well. All human societies progress through this notion, through this sort of model, this set of stages that Marx and Engels outlined. The word progress should remind you, perhaps, of the Enlightenment. Marx is coming out of an Enlightenment tradition that sees progress as part of, an inevitable part of the human condition. The world is getting better. We are moving forward gradually to a better, brighter, more just, more perfect, more equitable society. That's a key aspect of Enlightenment thought in the 18th century, and Marx is very much influenced by that, very much coming out of that, that Enlightenment notion. So the various stages that Marx outlines here, I just want to go through these very quickly. Marx argues that the very earliest human societies existed in a kind of economic mode that he calls primitive accumulation, hunter-gatherer stages, right? And that gradually through time, through the classical age, through the medieval period, we come to the idea, we come to the stage of feudalism, right? Feudalism, a system in which wealth is based in land. The nobles and vassals who control land derive their wealth from the serfs, the peasants who farm that land. Gradually, and for Marx, the breaking point is the French Revolution of 1789, we moved out of the stage of feudalism and into the stage of capitalism. And Marx, writing in the middle of the 19th century, says this is where we are right now in Europe. The industrialized countries have moved away from a land-based agrarian mode of economic production into a new industrial, mechanized, factory-based mode of production in which those who control the factories and the resources and the finished goods control economic and political power in that society. And Marx said this is where the industrial West is when he was writing in the middle of the 19th century. Eventually, and we'll talk about this transition, capitalism will crumble. It has to, Marx says, for reasons we'll get to in a moment. Capitalism will fall in a revolutionary cataclysm, and we will move into socialism, in which the working class controls the means of production. The workers who do the work will reap the rewards and benefits from their labor. From socialism, we will move forward into communism, the highest, most perfect form of economic organization, in which everyone possesses an equal share in the bounty that society produces. There will be no haves and have-nots. There will be no class enmity. There will be no class struggle. You won't have people exploiting the labor of others. We will all share equally in this glorious paradise of equity and equality. And Marx said that's the end of history. What did he mean by that? He didn't mean that the world was just going to blow up when we hit the stage of communism. He meant that if the study of history is the study of social conflict that pushes us forward and upward along this arrow of progression, by the time we get to communism, there's nothing beyond that. We will have reached the end point, the final destination of humanity's long road trip toward perfection. Now, how do you get from stage to stage? This is very important for Marx. Class struggle, as he put it, class struggle, the struggle of the have-nots versus the haves, the down and out versus those who are wealthy and property. That's what has always pushed forward the engine of history, right? The transition, again, for Marx that was so important here was to look back at the transition produced by the French Revolution from the old feudal order into the new capitalist order. A revolutionary upheaval had taken place to bring about that transition. Power was taken from the nobles and given into the hands of the new middle class. Similarly, a revolutionary upheaval will take us out of the current stage of capitalism and into the next pit stop on our human journey of socialism. So for Marx, this is very important. Each stage produces wealth and power, but it's a wealth and power that is produced through exploitation. There are those who are doing quite fine in each of these stages, but there's always an underclass. And that underclass will one day get angry enough, upset enough to rise up in revolution and take economic power for themselves, seize the political power that accompanies economic power, and we move forward into a new stage. So to understand how this locomotive of history moves forward, we have to understand that it's class struggle that pushes history forward and ever upward. So progress is built in. Progress is inevitable. And that's an important point to bear in mind. That's part of what explains the appeal of Marxism to European and Russian audiences in the late 19th and early 20th century. So we, Marx says, are in this phase of capitalism. So for Marx, capitalism was a very unequal mode of production. You have a small number of people, the bourgeoisie, as he called them, the middle class, the capitalist class. They own the means of production. And in the 19th century industrial economy, the means of production means the factories, the raw materials, the railroads, modes of transportation, modes of communication, the finished goods produced in the factories. The bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, the propertied class, the moneyed class, they own the means of production under the capitalist system. They derive the wealth, they derive the benefit, but they don't do the work. Who does the work? The working class. And the bourgeoisie exploits the working class just as viciously, just as relentlessly as the old landed gentry had exploited the peasant serfs under the feudal system. Under capitalism, the capitalists control the means of production. They live off of the surplus value generated by the labor of the workers. The workers have nothing. The workers, in order to survive, have to sell their labor power to the capitalists, to the bourgeoisie, in order to survive, just for a crust of bread to feed the family in the new industrial economy. So for Marx, the two competing classes that exist in the capitalist system are the bourgeoisie, who control the means of production, and the working class, the proletariat, who are exploited by the bourgeoisie. That relationship for Marx, he describes in his writings very vividly as a monstrous, inhuman relationship. The capitalist, he writes, is driven by a vampire thirst for the living blood of labor, a werewolf hunger for surplus labor. The capitalist desire, like these monsters in his imagery, the capitalist desire to extract, to suck out as much value as possible from the working class. The working class is disposable. You suck out the value from them, and if need be, you replace them with others. In a famous passage from Das Kapital, Capital, Marx describes that exploitative relationship between the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, and the proletariat, the workers. He says, capitalists mutilate the laborer into a fragment of a man. They degrade him to the level of an appendage of a machine. They destroy every remnant of charm in his work and turn work into a hated toil. So the worker feels alienated from his work. In olden days, the craftsman could take pride in the furniture he produced and the crafts he produced through his own skill. Now the worker is just at the machine pulling levers, part of the system of division of labor. Capitalism has destroyed the beauty and charm of work. It's made work into something despised, something hated. Marx goes on, the capitalists distort the conditions under which the worker works. And if you think about the industrial economy in the 19th century and the rhythms of labor and the principles of factory discipline, you see what Marx is getting at. In the olden days, prior to the Industrial Revolution, a craftsman and artisan would pick up his work when he felt like it, put as much work into it as he wanted, then put it down to the next day. The rhythms of the factory system make that impossible. Your time is no longer your own. You are beholden to the blast of the factory whistle. And so the capitalist system has enslaved the workers, according to Marx, and made them subject to a new notion of time. Time is no longer their own. Time is determined by the desire of the capitalists to maximize profit, keep the workers working 10, 12, or more hours a day in order to fuel the furnaces of the factories and maximize the profit for the capitalists. So Marx often has a very bad reputation of being a boring writer, but you can see, I think, from these select passages, a very evocative, a very vivid writer. He was a man who had to make his living through journalism, so he knew how to turn a phrase. Capitalism, which Marx defines as an unjust, unequal, exploitative system, capitalism will continue as long as it's able to exploit the workers. Capitalism will extend working days, extend working hours. Capitalism will pay bare minimum wages to the workers. Capitalism will allow working conditions in the factories to deteriorate, so far as legislation and public opinion will allow, all in the name of profit. And again, it doesn't matter to the capitalist whether the individual worker drops dead or loses a limb in the machinery, because if one worker or 20 workers should fall, there's a steady stream of labor just waiting to enter the factory gates because they have no other choice. They have to work in this system to feed their families. So the capitalist system, as Marx lays it out, is a very different kind of system than Adam Smith and other champions of the capitalist system in the 18th and early 19th century had argued. They sing the praises of capitalism as an opportunity for individuals to make something of themselves, of individuals to make a name, make a reputation, make a fortune for themselves. Marx says, well, okay, some can, but the vast majority can't. And for Marx, the fundamental problem with capitalism is that it's unjust. It's unfair. He writes, labor produces for the rich, in other words, the workers create and produce for the capitalist class wonderful things. Right? Capitalism does do good things for some, a few, at the top. He goes on, but for the worker, it produces privation, it produces misery, it produces poverty. Capitalism produces palaces, but for the worker, it produces hovels, slums. It produces beauty, but for the worker, deformity. It replaces labor by machines, but it turns the workers themselves into machines. It produces art and intelligence, but for the worker, it produces idiocy and cretinism. The capitalist system beats the workers down. There's one bright side for Marx to all of this, is that the capitalist system, with all of its inequities, with all of its inequalities, is doomed to fall, just like every mode of economic organization in human history has fallen before it. Why will capitalism fall, according to Marx? How will capitalism fall? When you read, for Friday's discussion, The ABC of Communism by Bukharin and Preobrazhensky, they are writing a book for, let's say, undereducated worker and peasant audiences after the October Revolution, trying to take Marx and distill it down. So in the sections that we're looking at, one of the points that Bukharin and Preobrazhensky talk about is the inherent contradictions of capitalism that will lead to its demise. So we'll talk about that on Friday. But for Marx, in Marx's writings, there's a fundamental flaw in the capitalist system that will make it fall. What is that flaw? For capitalism to work, for profit to be maximized for the benefit of the bourgeoisie, you have to create a disciplined, organized labor force. And by doing so, Marx says, capitalism has dug its own grave. The workers will be the grave diggers of the capitalists, he says. So the irony for Marx is that the capitalist system has called into being, created, if you will, the very class that will one day destroy it. The image that Marx uses is the old medieval legend of the sorcerer's apprentice. If you've seen Fantasia, you know, Mickey Mouse summons the brooms to life to do his bidding, and all hell breaks loose. That's a Disney cartoon, but is based on a very old medieval European legend or fairy tale. And Marx compares the fall of capitalism, the inevitable fall of capitalism, to the story of the sorcerer's apprentice. He says, capitalist society is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld whom he has called up by his spells. In other words, the capitalist system has created the working class. It will one day no longer be able to control it, and the working class will destroy the capitalist system. So capitalism, through its relentless desire to maximize profit, has, ironically enough, sown the seeds of its very destruction. Why or how? Marx predicted, and this was a predictive element of Marx's writing, he predicted that in the future, as the workers come to suffer more and more from the ever increasingly competitive pressures of the capitalist system, they will one day throw down their tools, step away from their machines, and begin to foment revolution. They will band together. They will stand shoulder to shoulder, arm in arm, and overthrow the capitalist order. They'll seize the factories. They'll seize the mines. They'll seize the means of production. And they will establish what Marx called the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, Marx didn't have a lot to say about the dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin and the Bolsheviks will have a lot more to say, and they will try to create, after the October Revolution, a dictatorship of the proletariat. What do we mean by a dictatorship of the proletariat? That's another topic that Bukharin and Preobrazhensky cover in the ABC of Communism, and it's a point that I want to get to in our Friday discussion. When Marx and later Lenin talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat, we have to think about what these words mean. When we hear the word dictatorship, we might think North Korea. When Marx uses the word dictatorship, He's using it in the sense that it was used back in the days of the Roman Republic, almost 2,000 years before Marx was born. In the old Roman days, a dictatorship was a temporary mode of government. In times of emergency, when barbarians were at the gate, you would suspend the normal functioning of the republic and give temporary emergency power to a strong man, a general, who would resolve the crisis and then step back. So when Marx talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat, he's talking about a temporary expediency. For Marx, the dictatorship of the proletariat is a temporary blip in the transition from capitalism to socialism, in which political and economic power will be in the hands of the working class, and a workers' state will form. And we can build the socialist system in which the workers have control of the means of production, in which the working class controls both economic power and the political power that comes out of it in Marx's materialist view. Eventually, when the last skirmishes of the class struggle are fought and won, we will reach the stage of pure communism. National boundaries will disappear. We will emerge into this bright, sunny, propertyless, classless global society. Exploitation of man by man will end, and a just, truly equal, humane society will emerge, warmed, as Marx will say, by the rays of sun in the system of communism. So for Marx, the true heroes of revolution, the ones who are going to take us from capitalism into socialism, are the workers. They're the heroes of Marx's story, not the peasants to whom the populists and SRs, Chernoff and company, are looking in late imperial Russia. It's not the peasants, forget about them. Marx was very dim, or took a very dim view of the peasants. They're arch conservatives, they're clinging to their religion and guns, to use a modern day political metaphor. Expect no change from the peasants. Marx put all his bet, or laid all his bets, if you will, on the working class. It's the working class who will topple the capitalist system and usher in first socialism and lead the way to communism. In one of Marx's most famous passages at the end of the Communist Manifesto, he writes, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. You have a world to win." That first line, "Workers of the world, unite," is a phrase that Lenin and the Bolsheviks will seize. We'll see it on all sorts of posters and imagery. But I want to draw your attention. Obviously, workers are the audience here, right? It's the workers who will lead the revolution, but workers of the world. Marx saw this transformation from capitalism to socialism as a global transformation. The first domino would fall, Marx predicted, somewhere in Europe, maybe in England, maybe in the German states, maybe in France. And once that first domino fell, the rest of the capitalist dominoes would fall, and this would be a global revolution. Now, Marx, of course, thought that Russia was the last place in which that first domino would fall, for reasons that we'll talk about later. But Marx set his sights on England, Germany, France, because that's where capitalism was most deeply developed, where exploitation was most firmly felt. So naturally, in Marx's view, that would be where the socialist revolution would have its origin point, if you will. So, Marxism appeals to many workers, many intellectuals in the 19th century, in part, I think, because it's both rationalistic and utopian. What do I mean by that? Marxism is rationalistic insofar as it preaches that human development, human progress, history itself, operates and unfolds not at random, right? History is not a choose your own adventure story. History unfolds and progresses ever upward according to a scientific plan. The theory of historical progression, Marx argued, was scientifically demonstrable, just like gravity or planetary motion. You can go back through history, Marx says, crunch the numbers, study the accumulation of capital over time, and you can see how societies have moved forward along that path. And from past precedent, Marx extrapolated future outcomes. So in the 19th century, which took a very hard-eyed view of statistics, embrace the power, the explanatory power of numbers, of statistics. The data that Marx presented, the scientific way in which he laid out his theories and predictions attracted many to the Marxist movement. They saw it as a theory that made sense because it was grounded in data. It wasn't just some pie in the sky, guy on a soapbox in a park talking about the wonderful future that's going to unfold. It was data-based. It was data-driven, to use kind of modern office speak. So in that sense, Marxism was rationalistic. Marxism was also utopian, insofar as it sought to remake the world, to remake human society. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels write that the philosophers have merely written about the world. The point for a Marxist is to change the world, and to change the world for the better. And that promise of a brighter future around the corner, a brighter future that we can enjoy if we stand shoulder to shoulder with our fellow workers and those who are on our side, bring down the capitalist system, usher in the socialist and communist future. That appeals to many, that kind of romantic idea of changing the world, building a better world. And so ironically, these two complementary halves of the Marxist worldview, I think, help to explain why this philosophy of action is so attractive to so many in the 19th century. And, part of that we can understand if we go back to this idea of the base and superstructure. Once we change the base, once we move from capitalism to socialism, we're going to get a new superstructure. Again, this comes out of an Enlightenment worldview. Enlightenment thinkers had argued that in order to eliminate crime, for instance, you have to eliminate the socioeconomic soil in which crime could flourish. So you eliminate hunger, privation, want, poverty, you end up eliminating crime. So as we move from a capitalist base to a new socialist mode of production, we're going to create a new superstructure. We're going to create new modes of ethics. We're going to create new values. We're going to create new systems of family structure. We're going to create new roles for men and women. We're going to create new ideas of what's right and wrong. We're going to allow for the creation under socialism of new kinds of people, better kinds of people. Ultimately, under true communism, humans unexploited will be able to tap into the true power and essence of human nature. So when we get in a couple of weeks to the idea of Bolshevik culture building, building a new society, creating a new way of life, remember that this is that conviction that we can build the new Soviet man, create a new and better Soviet woman, comes directly out of this Marxist notion of the relationship between the base and the superstructure. And again, when we think about the appeal of Marxism to European and Russian audiences at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, we have to step back for a moment and think about how Marxism would have been received at the time. We know now, and as we'll see throughout this course, that Marxism in practice, like any ideology in practice, has led to enormous horrors. Think of the millions of victims of Stalin, of Mao in China, of Pol Pot in Cambodia, victims of this revolutionary desire to destroy the old world, create a new world, and eliminate all obstacles, human included, that stand in our way. So we know now in the 21st century the human toll of Marxism in practice, right? Just as we know the human toll of capitalism in practice. So in the 19th century, no one could have envisioned the sheer scale of victims, right? So for 19th century and early 20th century audiences, what appealed to Marxism was its explanatory power, the science behind it, right? The data behind it, and also this starry-eyed, utopian, romantic vision of creating a better world. And those two aspects, I think, explain why so many men and women across Europe and across the Russian Empire as well embraced this system, embraced this way of thinking, a way of thinking that told them that change was not just desirable, but inevitable. We will get from capitalism to socialism. And even if we don't live to see it, our children or our children's children will one day live under the communist utopia. And that promise of the inevitability of communism's triumph, not just a possibility, not just an off chance, but a guaranteed future outcome, helps, I think, to explain why so many embraced this theory. Who embraces Marxism? Primarily intellectuals, like Marx himself, but also the working class. The workers are the heroes of the Marxist story, right? It's the workers who will move us from capitalism forward via revolution into socialism. So this is a very, very quick and dirty kind of overview of Marxist theory. There's a lot I've left out, but the main points, again, that I want you to think about have to do with the theory of historical progression, how history moves forward, according to Marx, through these preordained stages, how it moves forward inevitably through class struggle. It doesn't just slide forward gently. There will be revolutionary and violent clashes. But in the end, we will reach that utopian goal. So I want you to think about the theory of historical progression. And I also want you to bear in mind, again, this relationship between the base and the superstructure, different modes of economic organization, different stages on the trajectory of human progress produce different superstructures. And that becomes, again, important when we think about the Bolsheviks' idea of culture building that Bulgakov will bitterly satirize in his comedic novella, Heart of a Dog, that we're reading in a couple of weeks. So I'm going to stop this lecture here. Probably gone on too far anyway. If you have questions about this basic principles of Marxism, please let me know. We'll talk about that, or bring them to the discussion, even better, bring them to the discussion on Friday, and we'll talk about them there. So email me or save them for Friday. I'm going to stop the share, and I'm going to stop this, stop this lecture, and then we're going to move on to thinking about how these ideas associated with Marx, how Marxism comes to Russia, and how a bold and daring Russian revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin will try to change Marxism, tweak it to fit Russian reality, so that we can speed forward along the engine or the rails of historical progress, speed that locomotive forward and get to socialism now, not 2 or 3 generations down the road. So we're going to talk about the reception of Marx and his ideas in Russia and the rise of a Russian Marxist movement. Okay, so we'll end here and pick up there. Thanks.